Hello and welcome to the Practical Animal channel. The channel is for you if you want to know what it takes to work with animals. Every week we arrange an interview with an animal industry professional and we put that exact question to them. This week's interview is with Professor Carl Jones. Carl is a conservation biologist who has saved many species of bird from extinction and has restored degraded ecosystems. He is, to my mind, most famous for his work on the Indian Ocean island of Mauritius, east of Madagascar, and for his restoration work of the critically endangered Mauritius Kestrel. And he's here today to speak with us about his career and what it took to achieve what he's achieved. Professor Carl Jones, welcome to the Practical Animal channel.
Hi, John. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you, Carl. How are you?
It's good to be here talking to you about, our joint passion of conservation and working with animals. And I hope I can give some inspiration to young people who want to go out there and make a difference.
Well, I've absolutely no doubt that that's what will happen, Carl. What I'd like to know today on behalf of the viewer is how you did it. So please would you describe to the viewer how your career progressed from start to the present day?
Okay, thank you very much. I remember you coming to Mauritius very well, and I remember the enthusiasm. And it's really interesting that we've had many hundreds of people working in Mauritius over the years, and many of them have gone on to make a big difference in the world, now running their own projects or involved with conservation or animals in one way or another. And I think my career started more or less in the same sort of way. As a young lad, I was very interested in animals, and I kept animals in my back garden, domestic animals, but also I did a lot of rehabilitation of injured birds, and I kept fox cubs and so on. And I remember, thinking, what do I really want to do with my life? And I kept saying, well, what I really want to do is to work in conservation. I want to go out there and save endangered species. And I remember one day being approached by my headmaster in school, and he said to me, Jones, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I want to travel around the world and work with endangered species. And he said, don't be so stupid, Jones. To do that, you either have to be intelligent or rich, and you're neither. Anyway, I didn't let him put me off. And as a young man, I just wanted passionately to work with endangered species. And I did have some kestrels in my garden, some captive ones that I kept, and I was successful in breeding them. And this was way back in the early 1970s, at a time when few people were breeding birds of prey. And then when I was a student, I heard about the plight of the Mauritius Kestrel. And I thought to myself, I can save that. I've bred kestrels. I can go to Mauritius and breed Mauritius Kestrels and save them. And so I got in touch with a number of people who were involved with the Mauritius Kestrel program, including John Cooper, who I know you've interviewed. And they got me an interview for the job. And I was offered the job of running the program. And so in 1979, in my early 20s, I went out to Mauritius to work on the Mauritius Kestrel, but also the other endangered species there. And I lived and worked in Mauritius for 20 years. And in 1999, I left and I came back to Britain, but still overseeing the work there and acting as a director. And when I came back to Britain, I sort of handed over the day-to-day management of the program to young Mauritians. And I act a little bit like their mentor. If they've got any issues, they phone me up or I go over there. And I still help with a number of issues. And in most years, I go over twice a year and spend a month or so there, helping with issues, advising, and so on. But in recent years, I've become more involved with a whole host of other species for the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust, which is the organization I work for. And so I advise on programs worldwide, and I've become the chief scientist of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. So I get an opportunity to help with a whole range of programs. And so that's what I do these days. I spend some time in Mauritius, and I spend some time advising on a whole host of other programs worldwide. And I've been advising on some projects in Brazil with the blue-eyed ground dove is one of them, and the Alagoas antwren is another. I've advised on the conservation of the Guam kingfisher, which is extinct in the wild. And we're now looking for opportunities to introduce it onto another island in the Pacific. And I'm also doing work here in Britain, and I've been involved in the restoration of the red-billed chough to Jersey. And I'm looking at working on introducing wildcats back to either Wales or England. So I'm involved in a whole host of programs and projects, and I'm still very hands-on with a lot of the work. I do some field work myself, and I do quite a bit of teaching. So I teach at universities and I help supervise students. So I run a very busy life.
It sounds absolutely fascinating, actually. But what skills and personal qualities does a person need, Carl, to be a conservation biologist?
Well, that's obviously a very difficult question to answer, because conservation and working with animals is such a wide, broad subject. And, you know, you can't actually say there's one thing you need to do. The most important qualifications you need, and they're not really qualifications, they're basically a personal passion and a drive. I think you need to want to do these things, and you need to get lots of practical experience. And I advise anybody who wants to work in conservation is to get out there and just do a lot of volunteering like you did as a young man. And yes, of course, it is important to get qualifications these days. And you can get a host of, or do a host of sort of study programs on a range of subjects. And I advise anyone who wants to become a conservation biologist to study conservation biology at university and do an MSc or a PhD on the subject. And then you're very well qualified to go and work, hopefully, anywhere in the world.
What does it take to do what you did and to save multiple species and restore degraded ecosystems?
Well, that's a question that's often been asked, and I've now been involved in the restoration of many species. And in Mauritius, we have the reputation of having saved more species from extinction than any other country in the world. And in recent years, we've saved 5 species of birds, 3 species of reptiles, a fruit bat, and many, many plants, which without our action would have disappeared. While I get the credit for some of that, I don't know how justified it is, because one of the things that I've always done is, in my career, I've always surrounded myself by enthusiastic young people, many of whom are far more talented than I am. And they actually have helped deliver the conservation of these species. So yes, I worked in Mauritius for 20 years and I'm still working there. But I have the help of people from all over the world who bring in a large number of skills and talents. I also work with a number of academics who can help and advise us. So when you say, how do we do it? We did it over many years by bringing in people with the requisite skills to actually help direct us and to advise us. I think that one of the most important ingredients has been that we stayed involved for a long period of time. I've now been involved in Mauritius for 43 years, and hopefully I'll be involved for the rest of my life working there. And I've been able to get the backing and support of many organizations over many years, and that's been a great help. We've had the help of the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust since the beginning. We've had the help of the Peregrine Fund in America on and off for many decades, and similarly with Chester Zoo and other organizations. So I think it takes a team of dedicated people, but also a long-term commitment and the support of a number of organizations who just will not give up.
Brilliant. A related question, Carl, how would you describe global bird conservation today?
Well, that's quite an interesting question. And of course, there isn't an easy answer to that because there's lots of different approaches to global conservation. But I think it's changed dramatically over the last few years. And it's changed because we realize the enormity of the problem with many species declining. And, you know, every time people survey bird populations, we see increasing numbers declining. And also, as we realize that the planet is changing, we're seeing global climate breakdown, and we're also seeing massive anthropogenic change. So in recent years, we've seen a change of emphasis from the protectionist approaches of the 1960s and 70s to more manipulative and hands-on types of approaches, which you see today. They're still not as widespread as they should be, but we're seeing a lot of reintroductions and management of wild populations. And I think that is the way that it is going. We are seeing that sometimes we have to get involved, move species around, and when they've become extinct or disappeared from a particular area, to put them back. And of course, here in Britain, we've seen multiple reintroductions in recent years, and most of them have been highly successful. We saw the first one of conservation concern was the white-tailed eagle in the late 60s and 1970s. But predating that, we can go way back into the 19th century when capercaillie were reintroduced to Britain for sporting reasons. That wasn't a conservation introduction, but it was a very important one in that it showed, you know, what could be done. And more recently, we're seeing, you know, introductions or reintroductions of red kites, ospreys, goshawks, red-billed choughs, great bustard, and so on. So I think the future, we're going to have to learn how to manage bird populations more intensively, and we will be manipulating populations a lot more and moving them around. And if climate change is as great as people predict, it's going to be the only way to save a lot of species is by moving them from one area to another and by managing populations. I'm an optimist. I think that, yeah, there are huge challenges, but we can also address a number of those. And I think the future, we're going to have to really learn a lot more about how to actually manage bird populations, but also how to manage habitats and ecosystems and all the other things that sort of make a complete ecosystem. But we can do it. But we have to become a lot more practical. And science needs to be a lot more applied. Yes, it's fine to study things and to learn about them, but we also need to learn how to look after them and to nurture populations and nurture systems so that we can maintain biodiversity and ecological complexity.
You've mentioned a few things about how you see bird conservation developing in future. In what other ways do you see it developing over the next 20 years? I mean, Is it necessary for everybody involved professionally to be a graduate, or is there scope for people who are not with a degree?
No, of course, you need all sorts of skills. And certainly in the work I'm involved with, we have lots of graduates, but we also have people with other skills. And for example, on oceanic islands, one of the main skills you need, or one of the main attributes you need, is to be able to control invasive species. And so in recent years, I've worked with a lot of hunters and gamekeepers who can actually help us control invasive species such as rats or cats or mongooses or what have you. And of course, we need a lot of those soft skills that people may have, such as, good field workers. Not all good field workers have degrees. In fact, many of them have just learned from experience. And we need people with avicultural skills. And, we employ, or we use a lot of people with zookeeping skills. Yes, a lot of them do have degrees, but some of them don't. But they're very good at sort of hand rearing birds or artificially incubating eggs. So we need people with a range of skills. But I would advise anyone who wants to work in conservation biology to get some formal training if they can, as well as developing their passions and their soft skills.
Carl, you've trained hawks and falcons. What's the most treasured item in your hawking bag?
Well, that's a fascinating question. I've spent my whole life keeping and working with birds. And there hasn't been a time since I was 13 years old, which is now over 50 years ago, when I haven't had birds around me, captive birds, and I've had birds of prey. I'm not a falconer, and I'd never call myself a falconer, but I do keep birds of prey, and I do fly birds of prey. And I just love that relationship you get with a bird when you train it and it's flying free. And it's expressing a lot of its natural behaviors. And what I really like is not so much hunting, although my birds do hunt, but I like what I call freestyle falconry. So the sorts of birds I usually fly are some of the non-traditional birds. I've flown kites. I've also flown eagles, but I've flown lots of buteos. And I just love seeing them fly, and I love seeing them being natural, being out there, behaving as they would in the wild. And my falconry bag, well, it carries all the traditional things, but I think that one of the most important items I have, which I don't necessarily carry in my hawking bag, is the hood. And a hood is something of great beauty, of course. And all falconers love beautifully made hoods. But to use a hood correctly is a great skill. And when used correctly, it actually helps calm the bird down, and it helps reduce stress. And what you're doing is you're manipulating the moods of the bird by using light. And of course, you can use it by taking a bird into a dark room or a light room. But by using a hood, you can actually do it quite quickly. So I really love using a hood. I don't think I'm particularly expert at using it, but I train all my birds to the hood. And I enjoy understanding how you can actually reduce stress levels by proper management. But I also, while we're talking about falconry equipment, I like the use of bells, although of course you don't carry bells in your bag because that would be a great distraction. But bells on a hawk, when I started flying hawks, we didn't have telemetry. And so I learned how to interpret the sound of bells. And I think bells are very evocative. They remind me of those days flying, when I was a young lad flying birds. But also subconsciously, you know what the bird is doing by listening to the bells. And there are lots of different types of bells you can put on hawks. And years ago, we used to get them from Pakistan, from Lahore. And some of them were absolutely dreadful, but some of them were wonderful. And some of them were really clear. And more recently, we used bells from America called acorn bells. And I really like those. And there are some very good quality bells, which some of them are made of silver, which are just beautiful. So yes, I love nice falconry equipment, and hoods and bells are perhaps my favorite falconry equipment, although I like it all.
I can just remind the viewer that you are a professor of conservation biology, Cal. What 3 books have most shaped your thinking, please?
Oh my gosh. As well as being a lifelong naturalist, I'm also a lifelong bibliophile. So I love books. And ever since I was a young lad, I kept or I collected books. And, you know, I have a big collection of books. My home is full of books. I have about 6,000. And so to talk about which books most influenced me is exceedingly difficult. But of course, there are some authors that have had a profound effect. And of course, I work for the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. So Gerald Durrell has to be one of my heroes and somebody who influenced me. And, you know, of course, he produced lots of books in his time. And yes, I've read them all. And, you know, they're all absolutely enchanting. But I think one which really influenced me was this one, which is called The Stationary Ark. And in that he talks about his whole philosophy of zoos and captive breeding. And the book was written in the 1970s, when a lot of people thought that the answer to saving many endangered species was captive breeding and then reintroduction. And although a very powerful technique, it's not the whole answer, of course. And Jerry Durrell in the 70s thought, you know, we could save lots of species by captive breeding and reintroduction. And of course, he's true, of course we can, but we've moved on since then. And so this book is beautifully written, talks about Durrell's philosophies, but it was a little bit naive. Since then, we've moved on a long way. And the way to save species is, yes, to have captive populations, but we have to learn how to manage them in the wild. So that was a great influence, or Jerry Durrell was an influence. But I think the one author who had the greatest influence on me was the Austrian ethologist, student of animal behavior, Konrad Lorenz, who wrote a whole range of books. And one of the most delightful ones that I read as a student was King Solomon's Ring. And I have a copy of it here. In fact, I love my copy so much, I've had it leather bound. And I've got all of Lorenz's work. And Lorenz was a great scientist. He showed us the value of understanding animals and behavior. And in King Solomon's Ring, he talks about studying animals from a scientific point of view, but he also talks about getting to know animals. He talks about the value of intuition, about knowing a species so well, you start to think about it. And he was one of the people, or the person, who really influenced me about the value of really knowing an animal, not just scientifically, but to be able to empathize with it and to become intuitive about it. So I think that a good conservation biologist needs to have the objectivity of a scientist, but needs to be empathetic and intuitive, like a bird trainer, a falconer, or an aviculturalist. And I think that's really important. And I think so many scientists today are very good at objective science, but they're not very good at getting inside the minds of the species they work with. And when you talk about that whole approach, there was a very influential book in my life, which was published in the early 1970s, and that was Wildlife Tame but Free by H.G. Hurrell. And Hurrell actually, he wasn't a biologist by profession. He was I think he was a lawyer, or he was certainly involved in the legal profession. But his hobby was working with animals, and he liked having animals at liberty. And he talks a great deal about keeping hawks at liberty around his home, or having animals that he could release and that would come back. And I found that very influential. So those are three of the books that have influenced me, but of course there have been many, many others. And if you were to ask me next week the same question, I think I'd come up with 3 different books. But at least in those 3 books is captured the types of approaches that I really like. The objectivity of the science and the hands-on involvement with the living animal and that relationship that you gain with it.
I remember something that sticks in my mind. Now, I can't remember whether it was you speaking in a televised documentary or whether it was in person when I was in Mauritius with you. But you once used this term gestalt psychology. What does that mean? Is that the intuitive and empathetic treatment of animals?
Yeah, and that comes straight from Lorenz and that sort of era of ethology. The early ethologists talked about getting to know a species so well. You can fill in gaps in your knowledge by intuition. Yes, you've got to back it up with good science. But yes, they talked a great deal about the gestalt approach, which was, immersion in the species, understanding the species, and coming up with ideas about how the species should behave or what the problems are. Yes, it's very much part of that tradition, and it's what I call today deep knowledge. It's knowing something so well you can actually start to understand what's going on without necessarily having all the scientific information. And if you remember, when we actually were working on critically endangered birds in Mauritius, I encouraged all the staff to basically live with the animals so they could think about them sort of second nature, became second nature to them. And if you do that enough, you actually develop hunches about what's going on. And the more experienced you are, and the greater the depth of your knowledge, the more likely you are to be correct in your intuition.
Brilliant. Carl, does the Mauritius project still take volunteers?
Yes, we do, but things have changed a great deal from the days when you were there. In the 1990s, people used to come and go all the time, and there were no restrictions, or very few restrictions. Whereas today, even volunteers have to have work permits, and there's a lot of process involved. And we have to convince the government that if people are coming in from outside, they're not taking a position that could be occupied by young Mauritian. And of course, that's the right way to go. But also they put an age limit on it. So nobody comes out to Mauritius these days under the age of 20. And it tends to become quite a bureaucratic process. So it's very difficult to get volunteers into Mauritius. So what we have done is we've developed intern programs, and we do get young professionals coming to work with us. And it tends to be a lot more structured. And we have an intern program which we run through the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Program. But we take far fewer volunteers or interns than we did when you came to Mauritius. And we take a lot more young Mauritians, which is fine. And, that's the way it should go. But of course, when we take young Mauritians these days, we pay them. So the situation has changed. But we still do take a small number of interns in Mauritius. There are still lots of volunteer opportunities on projects throughout the world, as well as the one in Mauritius. And I urge anyone who wants to work in conservation, volunteer on programs either in this country or abroad. It's essential. Follow your dreams. And I tell everyone this, that as you know, as you're growing up, if you have a great passion, you should follow that and do what really inspires you. Because if you don't, I think you're always going to regret it. So, you know, if you really want to get out there and try and do something, do it. And, you know, you'll always find some way forward. It might not be exactly as you'd imagined, but the world is such a wonderful place, and there are so many opportunities today that young people who really want to become conservation biologists could get out there and, you know, follow their dreams. And the chances are that if you're driven enough, you can really make a substantial difference.
Fantastic. Carl, is there anything else you'd like to add?
There's lots of things I'd like to add. And what are you thinking about, John?
Can you talk a little bit about your Andean condor involvement?
Okay. Well, I told you that since the age of 13, I've always kept birds. And I've kept all sorts of birds. Or should I say, I keep animals, all sorts of animals. I've kept reptiles, and I've kept mammals, and I've kept invertebrates, and I've kept lots of birds. And what I've done in recent years is I've tended to keep a small number of species, which I keep because I like them, of course, and I enjoy that relationship. But also, I keep them for professional reasons as well. Because I am so fortunate that I have a job, which is my life as well, and my passion, I don't see my work as work. I just see it as the way I live. And I see my birds in the same way. And I keep birds so that I can understand them better. And I can use that knowledge to help save endangered species. And a number of years ago, I kept thinking about what birds could I learn the most from. And I kept thinking about some of the challenges in conservation, in bird conservation. And it seemed to me that some of the most problematic species to manage and to look after in the wild were long-lived, social, highly intelligent species. So that is, you know, large parrots, crows, for example. But also, I started to think about some of the more social, longer-lived raptors. And at the time, they were beginning to work on California condors, and they were having lots of issues with them. And they were also discovering a great deal about how to manage them and look after them. And I was fascinated by condors. And so I decided that after I left Mauritius, that I would, here in Wales, I would keep highly intelligent birds and try and learn about them. And of course, I thought, wouldn't it be nice if one day I could get some Andean condors? And I was very fortunate that I was able to find some birds, ex-zoo birds. And I built a big aviary in my garden. And I keep Andean condors, and I've kept them now for many years. And in fact, I can honestly say that Andean condors were the consequence of my midlife crisis. When I came back to Britain, I kept thinking to myself, you know, I really need to do some things. There are some things I haven't done in my life. You know, there are some things I've got to pursue some of these ideals. So I built a large aviary, which cost a fortune. And I ended up getting some condors, and I now breed condors. And we've bred several here. And both the birds that I started with were ex-zoo birds. They'd both been hand-reared. They were both in middle age, and they were both regarded as imprints and as being, how shall I say, a bit complex, and that they wouldn't breed naturally. However, I'm pleased to say that after working with them now for many years, I've got them breeding naturally and they rear their own youngster. And I have 3 birds. I've got the adult pair and there's a youngster in with them, which has been in there now for 2 years, and they all get on very well. So I've learned a great deal from condors, and they're my pride and joy. I enjoy the complexity of their psychology, the depth of their behavior. And although I don't do a lot of formal studies, I spend a lot of time watching and thinking about them. And they've given me great insight into, you know, what makes these large, long-lived, complex birds really tick. And yeah, so they're my indulgence. And I justify it by saying it's part of my job. But, you know, I'm not a falconer. And when falconry friends come around and see me, they say, Carl, why have you got andean condors? And I say, well, I just love them. I think they're the most wonderful birds. Anyway, it's not to be recommended as a household pet because the males in particular can be exceedingly dangerous. And my male, his name is Carlos, I don't go in with him anymore, but I used to go in with him years ago. And he knocked me down several times. And, you know, he can attack, depends on his mood. So they are potentially very dangerous birds, and they have to be managed very carefully. Anyway, those are my condors, and I could talk to you all day about them because I love them so much. And they're, yeah, I work with lots of birds of prey, but they're far more complex than anything else I've ever worked with.
I think we probably could talk all day and all week, but time is against us. Professor Carl Jones, Scientific Director of the Mauritius Wildlife Foundation, Conservation Biologist, thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal Channel.
Thank you, John, and I hope between us we can inspire young people today to go out there and actually do something to help look after this wonderful planet and all the wonderful plants and animals that live in it. Thank you very much.